Hey, Vanessa, stay with us. We want to bring you into a couple of ending conversations, if you will. And one is what we saw most recently from Donald Trump. And it moved Univision to take the Miss USA pageant off the air, which he is part owner of. Let's take a look at what he said.
When do we beat Mexico at the border? They're laughing at us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
Mr. Trump went on to say that he suspects that some of those people are decent, and he went on to continue to put, in my opinion, his foot in his mouth. What do you think about that?
It is extraordinary that a person who, on the very day that he says that he's going to be running for president of the United States, he makes comments like this about the Latino community generally. Now, Univision has pulled out. Of course they have, because they're smart. They know who their viewership is. But many artists have also decided to decline.
With a company like Univision, I mean, that's quite frankly still, as egregious as that was, a big step for them to step away and pull away. NBC suggested that, hey, you know, we don't appreciate what he said, but they're not going to necessarily not bring The Apprentice back. So what's your thought there in terms of, some would say, the bravery of Univision for stepping away?
No, I absolutely applaud their thought leadership in really taking a stand and letting everyone know what they stand for and what they will not stand for. This decision, just as Donald Trump made a decision to alienate a very powerful voting bloc, that was his decision to make. Univision also made a decision to say this is not something we will tolerate, and I think that was very brave on their part.
Horace, obviously it was calculated. He knew exactly what he was going to say on that day. So, as shocked as it may have been to some, that was calculated.
When I was watching him, I thought, boy, this seems so much just free-flowing, so much wasn't really anticipated. But I'm interested in seeing the narrative of the coverage of what his comments were taken and how, say, Hillary Clinton's recent visit to Ferguson almost a year later after the event where it was hot has appeared, and also how little conversation there has been about her and her husband's regular celebrations.
I'm not sure
of
the
Confederate Day.
That's
Confederate Day.
So
they honored and acknowledged Confederate Day for the 8 years that they served as governor and first lady. Now, very little coverage of that. This very prominent coverage. I find it curious.
Because he calls Mexican Americans criminals and racists, just like
I have
see
heard
that the African American community over and over again is symbolized, and those words are used in the same way.
Let me take it back to Vanessa and ask you, as one who runs a magazine and you look on a day-to-day in terms of decisions being made here, how much do you buy that this was calculated and this candidate was speaking to a specific audience?
I agree with you, Ed, that once you make a decision to jump into and throw your hat into the ring, you're very clear that anything that you say can be interpreted a certain way. So if you're making certain statements about particularly a specific group, that means that there may be someone that you're trying to align yourself with. There's a philosophy that you're trying to align yourself with. And I would not be surprised if this was a calculated move on his part.
All right. Let us turn our attention to what we knew was going to eventually come about in Colorado when marijuana was legalized there, and unanimous conclusion of the Supreme Court on Monday closely watches whether or not, in fact, you can be fired from an employer by means of testing positive for marijuana use when it is legal in that particular state. Now, some will argue that if you come to work drunk and alcohol is legal, they can fire you. But here, it's a question of if it's in your system and it's really impairing you from doing your work.
Well, I think it was a little tighter than just that. It was, had you used it in the last 30 days, and the employer had a ban on any use of any kind, and this individual said that they had a medical need that caused them to do so. Now, it's going to be a real question if the Supreme Court of the United States is going to give us and recognize a constitutional right to use recreational drugs in our free time. At present, they haven't, and we're left with the rule your employer gets to decide. If you're smoking cigarettes or marijuana and they don't like you to do that and they test for it, they're allowed to fire you over.
Or drink. Or drink, right? Maybe your employer doesn't like you to have wine with dinner, and then so how far are they going to go?
Fatty foods.
I think that's a question. I think that the other question that we also need to discuss is that African Americans and whites smoke marijuana in the same amounts, yet African Americans get arrested for having even small amounts of marijuana at almost 4 times the rate. And so I think that we also need to have, as part of this conversation, this issue about our war on drugs and our mass incarceration, and the fact that some states have chosen to legalize marijuana usage, what that will do to the rate of incarceration for people of
Ray,
color.
before you jump in, let me ask Vanessa, in terms of that slippery slope argument, if you will, what's your concern, if any, that we are seeing this parsing of what you can and can't do, legal, not legal, the auspices of your employer? What's your thought there?
We've just seen our former Attorney General, Eric Holder, make some great strides within this realm around the issue of sentencing reform. If we go by what we've seen in the past, especially around the ideas of mass incarceration, there's a lot of questions around that. So it'll be interesting to see, but yet here's another kind of potential red flag for us.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think ultimately we're asking questions of how much power we want to give employers. And so just as we alluded to the fact that there's a potential slippery slope there, we as a society have to ultimately decide how much power we want those employers to have. And once we come to that conclusion, then we can be able to govern ourselves accordingly in a universal sense, because just because something is legal does not mean a particular employer may allow you to do it or want you to do it. But again, the question comes, well, if I was performing my job reasonably and functionally well, you have no justification to test me. If you have no justification to test me, but I do fail the test, there's
Yet oftentimes when you come aboard, there is, and there are in many cases, random drug testing and the like. So the question becomes, again, impaired judgment because of, am I able to do things recreationally? So this really does open up a bigger legal question.
Well, it is a bigger legal question, and I don't want to wonk too much about this, but most of the country operates under what's called at-will hiring and firing. If the narrative that you describe occurs and we change that, you're going to make it harder for people to get jobs, because if it's harder to fire you, it will be harder to hire you.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Vanessa, thank you very much. I'll see you 4th of July weekend down there in New Orleans. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. See you soon.
All right, and I thank you all for joining us. Very spirited discussion today. Greatly appreciate it. We're going to take another break here. Remember, we want to hear from you. Give us a shout, and I'll be back with my view right after this.